Derby was initially founded as a Roman settlement in 80 AD. It was initially named Derventio. Now, has anyone been to Chester Green? Not the police station, I'm not trying to judge you all. The Chester Green area was originally where the Roman camp of Derventio was set up. Now named Little Chester today, Chester Green, the Chester Green area, or the current lockup. Now, current lockup brings us exactly to where we are today. Right here is the old lockup, the old Derby jail for Derby city centre. If you were a ruffian, a wrong-un, or did some sort of wrongdoing throughout Derby's history, chances are you'll be taken to one of the Derby jails. Now, at one time, there were 2 Derby jails in operation, 4 in total history. The first and earliest was right here. It extended from the archway to the bottom, to the edge of the Guildhall Theatre, about 100 yards that way and about 10 yards that way. Nothing of it remains today. Absolutely nothing. A lot of people will come and tell you on a ghost tour that you can get to certain tunnels, certain caves that were used as prison cells. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. There are tunnels, there are catacomb of tunnels underneath our very feet, which go about 50 yards that way, about 100 yards that way. But they're mainly used for the cellarage of the Tiger Bar, or as storage, or they're locked off and sealed by the council when no one can get to. And they will use various things as bomb shelters, storage, beer storage, but that's about it. Now, Derby's lockup yard has quite an important history. It's first serving as Derby Jail. Once it closed and the Derby Jail moved up to Friargate, this remained open. It remained as an active cell. And by active cell I mean one end to the other, pretty much where I would stand right now, there would have been 8 to 10 jail cells. Barrel vaulted, and again, if you were doing some sort of wrongdoing, such as setting fire to a bale of hay, urinating in the street, stealing an apple, or murder or rape, or any of those bit more gruesome crimes, chances are you'd be brought here, you'd be locked up, and you'd be taken to your trial. And your trial will be held at the Derby Magistrates Court, as it still stands today, the old Assizes Court for Derby. And if you're lucky, you'll be taken to one of the other jails around Derby City Centre, such as Friargate, Vernon Gate, if it's a little later in history, or you'll be brought back here to serve your time. If you were unlucky, you'd be brought back here, you'd be locked up for a day, a week, sometimes even locked up for several months on end. At which point you'd be taken to your place of execution. Already sounding good already, yeah? Place of execution. Any volunteers to be executed? I'm sure I can arrange something. Never any takers. So, if you were taken from your place of execution, you'd be placed in chains in this very market, and either walked publicly out the entrance you've walked through today, or taken through a very long corridor just underneath the Guildhall, which will come up just the other side of the Guildhall clock. We'll walk past it later on, I'll show you where you would have come out. You'd then be taken onto the market square, a noose placed around your neck, and you'd drop through the gallows, and that'd be it. That'd be over. You'd be dead. Most of the time. If you were particularly naughty, and you committed high treason, chances are you won't be hanged. Well, slightly hanged. You'd be hanged, drawn, executed. Normally, high treason, those kind of things when a phone goes off and you have to run out and take it. But you have this horrible, suffering death. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is a place we're going to do later on, one of the stories I will tell you, features hanging, drawing, and quartering. At which point I will be asking for at least one volunteer. Again, no one raises their hand. I'm disappointed in everyone. So, Derby Lockup Yard. Does anyone know any of the stories associated with the Derby Lockup Yard we're here today?
Policeman killed.
Just one policeman. That is correct. 12th of July. PC Joseph Moss unfortunately lost his life in this market. Well, market area, the old lockup yard. A gentleman named Gerald Manwaring, a nobleman of some form from Staffordshire, came down to Derby on a what's the best way to put this that's politely, a last hurrah weekend. You see, he was a married gentleman. Fortunately, through a series of events, we don't know what happened to his wife. He seemed to have disappeared from all record. And he went to go live with his two sisters up in Ashbourne. And his two sisters were very secluded ladies. They kept to themselves, they didn't really do much, and they expected Gerald to do the same. He didn't really like that much. So he decided he was going to have one last hooray before he secluded himself out to the middle of nowhere. Ashbourne's not that bad, really. A few people nodding saying yes, it definitely is. So, he came to Derby and he stayed at the Royal Hotel. Cozy Club is now the Royal Hotel, just on the corner above the old post office. He stayed there for 3 nights. On the first night, he went downstairs, he gambled, he had a drink, he had a lovely time. On the second night, he went to the magistrate's court. Well, not to the court, but to the building next door, as the building next door was one of Derby's most famous brothels. He went inside, he picked out his favourite girl, and he took her back to the Royal Hotel. And I think they played chess, backgammon, those kind of things one evening. I don't know myself, unfortunately. But they had a wonderful time that evening. The following day, they decided they were going to get absolutely blind drunk. At this point, I can only imagine Gerald's weekend to be something like a Vegas weekend. They got up, they drank. They partied, they drank. They partied, they drank. One of them suggested it'd be a brilliant idea to get a pony and trap and drive it around the strings. The ye old drunk driving, as it were. And they careered throughout Derby marketplace, all the way up as far as where Markeaton Island is today, back and forth all afternoon. And it wasn't until one police officer from the lockup yard decided to confront them. He walked out of the entrance, stood in the middle of the road, and demanded that they stop. And they just carried on straight past him. So, he thought, better idea, get a couple of other officers. And he did. And this officer got another officer and the young PC Joseph Moss. And all 3 of them then stood outside and yelled, "Stop!" And this time, they didn't stop, they carried on again. The first officer then got his own pony and trap. He commandeered one from the street and chased off behind Mainwaring and his lady of the night, friend, for a polite term, and chased them all the way up to where the Travellers' Rest, just opposite the School for the Deaf, stands today. They arrested him in the car park, and they brought him back right here to the lockup yard. They were in the process of checking them in. They got Gerald, they were about to place him in cuffs, when his lady friend, Annie, decided she was going to kick up a little bit of a fuss. She decided she was going to fight the police officers. Bear in mind there were 7 of them at the time and she thought she'd be able to take them. Interesting, very brave. There was a slight scuffle, a slight kerfuffle, and unfortunately they tackled her to the ground and she didn't get away. However, in this commotion, it appears that Gerald had managed to reach into his pocket as he hadn't been cuffed. And inside his pocket was a revolver. He took the revolver out and he shot wildly into the air as the officers tried to take it off him. The first shot ricocheted around the room. The second shot also missed and ricocheted around the room, around this area we're in today. The third shot ricocheted around the room, bounced off a policeman's helmet, and I can assure you that's definitely not a euphemism, and it wedged itself in one of the policeman's arms. Fortunately, that was the only injury he sustained. However, PC Joseph Moss was shot on the 4th shot. That was a direct shot to the heart. He fell instantly to the ground and died on the spot. Now that spot is actually marked on the floor by some sort of small plinth. Most people when I told this story on a tour think it's that one just there. Nope, it's not. It's actually that one there the gentleman stood on the floor. A very small, very almost
Gentleman.
Sorry. It's actually the spot just there on the floor. It's where he fell, where he died. He was the first police officer in Derby to die on the job. It's very unfortunate. It is very unfortunate that the only plaque to commemorate him is the very small plaque that's quite often stepped on, walked over. and pretty much missed. Now you're here for a ghost tour, and all I've done so far is bore you a little bit about Derby's history and bore you a little bit about a police officer that was shot. I can assure you I'm going to bore you for the next hour or so as well, so get used to it. But what I like to do is tell you the history associated with the ghost stories. Anyone can come out and go, ooh, this is haunted, or ooh, that's haunted, or did you hear that? Yes, we heard it, we saw you do it as well. I'm not blaming anyone or any sort of TV shows, but we'll get back to that later on. Now, I like to tell you the history and then tell you the ghost story associated with it. And the ghost story associated is with the PC Joseph Moss, the PC that lost his life at the young age of 26. Now, there used to be a lady that owned a flower shop just here in the corner. During all this work, she's actually moved over into the corner. She's still doing very well. A lovely old woman, she's very, very sweet. And doing this research for this tour and the other tours that I do around Derby, I get to talk into the occasion with people that own the Tiger Bar, people that own the fish market stalls, you name it, they are one hell of a character, put it that way. Naturally, in a way, I always ask, has anyone ever seen anything? And I'll ask you guys, has anyone ever seen anything in the fish market? No, I haven't. If I see anything today, I'll run and scream, don't worry about it. You'll be the first people to know. But they're talking to this little old lady, and she actually told me that one day she came out early in the morning, as she does, to set her flowers out for the day. So when she was in the far corner, and she looked around, it was relatively empty. The first fisherman were coming in, putting some fish behind the stall. Nothing out of the ordinary. So then when she turned around, and noticed in the far corner, just over there, was a gentleman stood in a very long blue coat. I thought, oh, that's quite interesting actually. So I got to speaking with some of the owners of the Tiger Bar, some of the locals. I mean, let's be honest, they've had spirits of a different variety when they've seen things, but that's a different story altogether. And I got to talking with them, and quite a few people have said they've seen this same figure in a dark blue coat. And I got to thinking about this a bit more. And I got to talking with a gentleman out here one evening just after a ghost tour. And he also said to me he'd also seen the figure in the corner. So 3 or 4 people have come up to me and mentioned they'd seen this figure. A couple of them were stumbling when they told me about this figure, but that's completely different. And the first thing I did was actually laugh. Mainly because I'm the kind of person that comes out here of an evening and I dress in a very long blue coat when I do these tours. And for about 3 months when I was writing the scripts for these tours, I came out here on my own at about 9 o'clock at night, sometimes early in the morning before work, and I practiced the stories and I practiced the tours. And I used to always stand in that bottom corner. So for a while I was convinced that people were actually seeing me and thinking I was a ghost because I was that out of the ordinary. Imagine it, top hat, long coat, cane, I do look a little bit out of place. And I was talking a bit longer and I realised that these stories dated back 5, 10, 15, 25, in the case of this old woman, 35 years. Definitely older than me, definitely before my time. People have seen this same figure in the courtyard. And I've also had it happen recently. On a tour, I'd be talking away, mention it, and I'd come back here later on, talk to one of the owners of the Tiger Bar. I used to be quite friendly with Charlie. And again, there'd be people come up to me and say, oh, I heard you mention about the blue man on the tour. So we've all seen him as well. Okay, and coming on with that, I'm going to leave that direction. I never stand in that corner ever again. I am absolutely terrified. If something jumps out and goes boo, I will scream, trust me. Now, this blue gentleman never moves, never looks, no one's ever seen his face, no noise, no ominous presence, no gonna get you in the dark and murder you, nothing like that, no Hollywood horror film of a figure. Just a tall, dark figure stood in the corner of the room, corner of the fish market, sorry, as it would have been a room. Keeps to himself, minds his own business. You could even walk past him one day, go into the Guildhall market, coming from the Guildhall market, glance over, and a bit oddly dressed, wander off and go about your business. However, if you do see someone in here dressed in a blue coat and it's around about 9 o'clock at night, just check around. There could be a tour of around about 10 or 12 people and me shouting and screaming in the middle of them. If they're on their own, however, it's probably not going to be anymore. You may have seen them. Now, that's a lovely brief, I'd like to say that was a nice story, but it really wasn't. Unfortunately, a lot of the stories I'm going to tell you are going to be quite dark, quite gruesome and quite horrible. But That's the last story I'm going to tell you in here. We're going to move on. I'm going to tell you the next part of the story. We're going to go to just near the assembly rooms. So if you want to follow me, I'm going to lead the way. Again, I'll ask, is everyone with the people they came with? Everyone's here? Missing no one? Excellent. So, we're at the assembly rooms. And we'll move in? No. Everyone's been to the assembly rooms, I can assume? Yeah? Everyone, raise your hand if you've been, raise your hand if you haven't. The assembly rooms is a very interesting building. Originally, there was an assembly room that stood on this ground in 1765. It was erected. And it served as Derby's playhouse at the time. You could see comedy, you could see drama, you could see some very bad acting, you could see a gentleman with a beard dancing around with a cane. Not me, unfortunately. And it was on this ground till 1963. In 1963, there was a fire and it was demolished. And for a period of time, some of you may remember, no one's that bad, no one's that old, it's fine. For a period of time it lay barren, it lay wasteful. And in 1977, what we know as the assembly rooms was built. The building that you see all around you, which has now been mothballed and closed due to a fire in 2014. Now, a lot of the history to do with this building is a little bit of hearsay, unfortunately. As I said, the old building was burnt, knocked down, and the foundations, groundwork, ripped up, torn to shreds, crumbled back down and laid down into the concrete of this building. So we can't really point at any sort of old building, any sort of history really. However, the gallery we have up here, and the gallery on this side, which a lot of you are all stood beneath, is one of the most active parts of this building. So, every ghost story, every city, every old haunted building that's around about 100 years old always claims to have at least one of these, and it's an old grey lady. It's possibly the most common, the most talked about, the most notable ghost story, the old grey phantom that roams the floors. Unfortunately enough, this building has one. They have their own old grey lady, and she wanders down this side, along the edge, and back round, constantly in a circle. When I heard about this story, I thought, okay, maybe there is an old grey lady, maybe there isn't. It's the typical ghost story. I always like to take things with a little bit of pinch of salt, and always say, maybe there's an explanation for this. And again, in my research, I got to talk with some of the people that run Derby Live, some of the owners of the building, and I asked them, and when you ask Derby Live, they say, no, there's no such thing as ghosts. We don't have any sort of hauntings, nothing like that involved in this part of the building. Okay. But when you ask some of the staff, some of the managers, the duty managers, the people that are normally here very early in the morning, very late at night, parts of the building are still quite used today, part of the back and this part here. When you talk to those people, they have a different story. They do mention that there is a grey lady. They love talking about her. I think they actually are quite friendly with this grey lady. And when I did my bit of research, I asked them, what does she look like? And everyone described her as an old woman in a large Victorian grey dress. Again, it's the typical ghost tour, ghost walk. It's the typical haunting. And again, you take it with a pinch of salt. There isn't much history associated with it, just one person's word of mouth. Then, when I've asked a bit more about these stories, they've all mentioned the exact same thing. Different people have told me the same thing, which is strange. This lady isn't a full figure. It isn't like me or you, head to toe. She's actually floating about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. Sometimes it's just the legs that you see wandering around toward the tops of the building, as if they're on a floor that wasn't there. Now, if I was walking through the assembly rooms late at night, early one morning, and I saw a pair of legs just kicking through the ceiling, I would run and I would scream and probably cry. However, on different floors, people have also reported seeing this grey lady from this point upwards, which again is strange. It's as though there is a floor that's not there. She's either cut off and gliding along the floor chest up, or from the floor below, legs going across the ceiling. And I thought, okay, this has a bit more, there's a bit more to it. There was a building that was on the ground before. It was of a different level, it was 3 stories high. There were several different floors, and I'm pretty certain they don't relate to the current floor levels that we have here. So if it was a replaying of this old woman, this grey Victorian lady roaming her way throughout the building, perhaps an old owner, perhaps an actress wandering the building, she would be wandering at a different level to everyone else. But that's not my favourite story about this part of the building. My favourite story relates to the creepy part. When the staff are in late at night, early at the morning, it's always the case. They're cleaning away, they're polishing glasses, they do what they do. And they hear pitter-patter of footsteps, as though a small child running around. Now, children are creepy at the best of times. Yep, definitely someone agrees with that there. When you can hear the pitter-patter of footsteps running behind you, not just one set of footsteps, but 3 or 4, that would unnerve me definitely. When you couple it with a small amount of laughter, boyish, childlike giggling, okay, that would definitely put me on edge. It'd put me on edge a lot more if I were to turn around from the bar and see 4 young boys playing in the assembly rooms, running around, throwing things that aren't there to each other. That would unnerve me quite a bit. Now, these boys are seen throughout the entire building, playing, turning lights off, giggling, running, laughing, screaming to a degree. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about these boys other than the fact there are 4 of them. They're always seen 4 at a time throughout different parts of the building, never alone, never in 2s, never in 3s, all 4 at the same time. There's no record of 4 boys ever dying any sort of horrific death here, which would put a bit of pay to the ghost story. But, as I said, the assembly rooms has been mothballed. It is still under construction. They might tear it down, they might build on it again. If they do tear it down, hopefully they'll be able to shed a light on another story. There is a small amount of history associated with this part of the building. Now, this story relates very closely to someone I used to work with. For some people that do know me, I know there's a couple of familiar faces here, and for this gentleman here will slightly know this. Richard Felix is the reason I got into doing these ghost tours. He trained me up to be a tour guide. For a long period of time, I was the person that jumped out and went boo if you went on a ghost tour. I stopped doing that after someone broke my nose. Yeah, not fun. So that's why I don't have anyone jump out on any of my tours. I don't like to put anyone in that position. But I spent a lot of time with him essentially learning the ropes of this paranormal, historical world. And a lot about the history of Derby. And one of the stories he was adamant about, absolutely adamant, is that when he was in Darley Abbey, he had a neighbour who was a builder. And this builder was a foreman. During the 70s, he was the foreman for the assembly rooms. He was in charge of putting the footings and the groundwork in. And when they were digging down, taking out some of the old foundations, they unearthed a large piece of stone. And beneath that large piece of stone was a Viking longboat. Now, instead of calling the council, instead of calling the museum, instead of calling anyone, this foreman claims to have poured concrete over the Viking longboat and buried it within the foundations of the building. We don't know where, it could be beneath our very feet. However, if you were to go to the museum, just round the corner, you'll see a Viking longboat within the museum. Pulled up from a different part of the city, it is a very ornate, very beautiful piece of Derby history. I mentioned earlier on about the Romans in 80 AD. we shoot forward a few hundred years to 877 AD, Vikings settled in Derby. They settled all over the place in the UK. York, Derby, London, they are just all over the shop. They were chaos. But they gave us a lot of things that we have today. Saddlergate, Irongate, Friargate, all end in the word gate. Now gate comes from the word gather, which is the Norse for street. Okay, they gave us the name of streets. Potentially, they also gave us the name of Derby. Now, the original Norse term for Derby was Dyrbu, the town of the deer, which to me sounds more like Nottingham, as we're associated with the ram these days, but we were initially associated with the deer. People believe that Dyrbu, through a form of colloquialism, became Derby, and it wasn't until 1610 that it became Derby on the first map, which are very significant. But as I said, there is a lot of Viking history associated with Derby. So potentially there is truth to Felix's and his builder friend's story, and that there is a longboat beneath our feet. If they do decide to tear this building down, hopefully we may see this longboat. Hopefully we may be able to bring it out and save it and keep it in the museum. Or unfortunately it's one of those tall tales, or the longboat's been lost to time. Now, again, that's a pretty light-hearted story. We're going to go on to our next part of the tour. It's just going to be very briefly over near the Silk Mill area, just in front of the Bonnie Prince statue. So if you want to follow me this way. Now, the next part of the story is actually related to the silk mill in the far corner. However, as we go past, I want to very briefly mention this gentleman on the horse behind me. And I will be very brief about this, as it is very warm and I'm dressed all in black and it is not pleasant, unfortunately. I wish I had shorts on. Gentleman on the horse, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Stewart. He was basically a general, a leader at the time. And he was trying to overthrow the monarchy in England. He came from Scottish royal stock. He was quite high up. He was one of the last royal kings or royal princes. He marched south. He was going to overthrow the UK government, the English government. And had he got to London, had he got to the crown, chances are he probably would have won. They were terrified. They thought he had a legitimate claim, and they genuinely thought he had a chance of overthrowing all the army down there. However, in 1745 he marched south. In September he got to Edinburgh. Following on from there, in December 3rd to be precise, he got to Ashbourne. He stationed his troops in Ashbourne, where he had 9,000 troops, which doesn't sound a lot. However, 9,000 troops could easily overthrow a small town, a small city, and it had put an army up for a good run for its money. On December 4th, the Prince, some of his generals, some of his soldiers marched south. They marched south to Derby. On December 4th, they came into Derby city centre and went to the Djrs Inn. Not for a swift half or anything like that, but they went to the Djrs Inn, which is now the Djrs, and they banged on the door for dramatic effect and demanded that they billeted, fed and had somewhere to sleep for their 9,000 soldiers. Now, not many of the soldiers actually came into the city centre. However, a good few hundred did. And throughout all this, Bonnie Prince Charlie held his war council in Derby city centre and met with the Duke at the time, the Duke of Derby. Throughout this, they had a small discussion. The discussion was kept very secretive. However, it went along the lines of Derby's hero, the Duke at the time, essentially said, if you were to go any further than Derby city centre, if you were to get to Swarkston Bridge, the main route from the north to the south, the only route his soldiers could march on, that when he got to Swarkston Bridge, he'd be greeted by thousands upon thousands of Derbyshire soldiers, the Devonshire Blues. And our soldiers had muskets, they had swords, you name it, they had everything. Cannons, horses. They would essentially decimate his army. However, this was all just one big lie. What he actually did was forge some books to say he had this many soldiers. The actual army was, in fact, guarding the bridge. There were 76 of them. They had no weapons except from the ones they could cobble together from pitchforks, the occasional sword lying around. One of them did have a horse, but that was it, and it wasn't ready for battle at all. Essentially, they were farmers dressed in blue coats. Had the soldiers got to Swarkston Bridge, it would have been a massacre. However, a little bit of clever bookkeeping, a clever accounting, made the Bonnie Prince and his generals think, okay, maybe we've a bit more than we can chew here, lads. And the generals decided that they should retreat back north, think about a different strategy and try again. And they did. They essentially hightailed it back north. And for a few months they battled here and there with the King's army. And in April of the following year, 1746, at the Battle of Culloden, there was a massacre. Bonnie Prince's army was absolutely cut down with cannon fire. And that's where the revolution ended. As I said, had they got past Derby, there is a very good chance there would have been Bonnie Prince sat on the throne, which would have made for a completely different history. As I said, there isn't really much about this, it's just a very nice brief story I like to tell people. However, the Devonshire Blues army was still intact after this little fracas, let's call it, as in there never really was a battle. They stayed throughout Derby, and throughout Derby from the George, the Djrs, the Old Bell, the Dolphin just on the corner, the Silk Mill, a lot of the other taverns throughout Derby always claimed to have someone dressed in the Derbyshire Blues uniform haunting their building. Most famously is the Djrs, who claim to have their own Devonshire Blue soldier who haunts the ladies' toilets. Exactly. Now, I'm not sure if it's one of the owners or bar staff in a large coat with a camera, or something completely different. But they claim that this soldier is seen standing in one of the cubicles. And if he's not seen standing in the cubicles, a lady will go in, sit down, lock the door, as the door then unlocks and opens, and no one's there. So a lady will lock the door again, and then this time she can't unlock it. Every time she tries to unlock it, tries to pull on the door, tries to push on the door, absolutely nothing. It had got to a point a few years ago they had to actually break one of the doors down to let a woman out. That's how bad it was. She was found on the floor crying, saying that when she'd actually managed to get into the toilets, she saw a man dressed in a blue coat. She ran into one of the cubicles, locked the door, heard the door to the toilet slam, and assumed this gentleman had ran out. When she tried to leave the toilet, she found she was completely locked in. She began screaming, as I'm sure we all would, I'm sure I definitely would, until one of the managers came in and did have to kick the door down. Now this is coupled with the fact that the Djrs also has a Viking skull behind the bar, glasses smashing spontaneously on the bar, taps being turned on and off. But I still say the worst thing that could happen is if you are on your way to the ladies and you are confronted by a large gentleman in a blue coat. I can assure you it's not me on a ghost tour, it is the spirit of one of the Devonshire Blues. But luckily you are in the right place if you do see something like that. It's the very apt place to be. So the next story I will tell you is just in front of the Silk Mill, and it's quite a sad and gruesome story, unfortunately, and I will possibly need a child volunteer. So if you want to follow me this way. We're here in front of the Silk Mill, the old Silk Mill, as the pub suggests, just around the corner. Built in 1717, essentially this building started off the entire Industrial Revolution, not just for Derby, England, but the entire world. Now, there's a gentleman named John Lom. And he was a very, very clever gentleman. He decided he was going to go to Italy, and he was going to spend a bit of time in some Italian factories, learn a bit about their machinery, learn about their silk throwing machines, and how he could better them, produce them himself. What we would now call it is industrial espionage. He went over there and he claimed he was doing a little bit of work, but he actually stole plans for silk throwing machines. He then very quickly came back to the UK, to England, came back to Derby, and erected this building. Inside this building, 1717, was the first ever mechanised silk throwing machine. It was the best machine in the world at the time. It was a water powered mill, that's why we're on the river so close as we are, and at one point it had 300 members of staff, which is quite impressive. Very, very large building, very large amount of staff. Now these staff were a mix of the older overseers, the gentlemen that would be in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe a little bit longer if they're doing particularly well. But the majority of their staff, around about 180 to 200 members of staff, would have been children. And these are children that aged from 5 years all the way up to 15, 16, going on for 17, 18. These children were hired for a few reasons. One, they were damn cheap. I wish I could hire a couple of children to do this tour instead of me standing out here in the sunshine, I can assure you of that. Also, the other reason, they had very small, nimble hands and nimble fingers. They were also small enough to climb into some of the machines and fix them. However, that's not the best story about this building. One of the original parts of the building is the part we are stood just in front of here, and the tower to my right hand side. During the early 1900s, the building was sold on for different companies at different times, following the decline in the industrial processes here. It was sold to a power company for a number of years before it was sold back to be a museum. However, throughout all this time, they kept certain core parts of the building, the part behind me and the tower. The tower is possibly my favourite part of the building. It has a very old, rickety elevator inside it that is just really horrible to be in if you don't like lifts, like me unfortunately. But also it's possibly the oldest and most original part of the building, and it relates very importantly to this story. In the mid 1800s, towards the earlier side, the 1830s, 1840s, there was a small boy. Unfortunately we don't know his name, but he was one of the small boys that was hired to go into the machines and pick out the small bits of cotton, the small bits of silk when the machine started to clog up and jam. He was the one that was most likely going to lose a finger, lose a hand in these machines. Now, he would have lived either locally or within the building, and he would have got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, done his job, had a very gruesome, miserly meal. Imagine Oliver, for example, and he would have gone to bed at 7 o'clock at night, perhaps even later if they had tight budgets to fit. Now this boy was generally pretty good at his job. He had the nimblest, the smallest hands, whatever made him good at his job, he was alright at it. However, on one day, he wasn't doing too well, let's say. He was probably feeling a little under the weather. He was going quite slow about his activities. And one of the overseers didn't take too kindly to it. He got his stick, a cane, a beating rod essentially, and he beat him black and blue a little bit. And you think, okay, this boy's probably going to try a little bit harder now, he's going to crack on a bit more, or he's going to get cracked on a little more. But no, unfortunately not. The boy was then taken to one of the officers right towards the top of the tower, and he was cussed out for not doing his job, for not working hard enough, for not doing what he could do to his best of his ability. This time, instead of beating him black and blue, they just pushed him straight down the stairs, the large staircase from top to bottom. The fall broke most of the bones in his body, He was found at the bottom of the tower, crumpled up in a heap, pouring out blood with bones poking out all over his body. He was still alive at the bottom. The fall hadn't killed him instantly. He did die a very unfortunate and slow death until the coroner came over and pronounced him dead. It took the coroner an hour to get there, and when the coroner arrived, he was still alive. So he suffered for at least an hour with these injuries. Now that's quite grim, quite gruesome. I can only imagine the cries this boy would have made. Now, I would ask for a small volunteer, but I don't want to make a boy cry unless they've been a bit annoying, but no, okay. So these cries would have been going on for half hour to an hour. Not very pleasant, not very nice. These cries are still heard. The building is again being mothballed by the council. It's going to be reopened in a museum in 2020. So the date we have at the current time. That's probably going to change. However, as you can see, there's a slight amount of construction work being done. Staff from when it was a museum a few years ago to the construction workers that are currently working on the building, along with some other various different ancillary staff that still run parts of the building, some of the exhibits that are on the upper floors. I've mentioned hearing a small boy, a small crying boy, whimpering. Often they've mistaken it for a boy being locked in. As it's been over the summer holidays, a couple of the builders have actually thought that maybe one of them's climbed the fence. They've had nothing to do over the 6-week holidays. They've tried to get in and have a bit of a play around on a building site. And they've heard these cries, they've gone looking, only to find nothing at all. These cries aren't heard every day, every hour, all the time. Otherwise it'd be a guaranteed hotspot for paranormal activity. I could just waltz you all in and you'd hear these cries. But they are heard around once every couple of weeks. Normally very, very late at night. Now, if this boy was unfortunately kicked to death at the end of his shift, I mean, you don't want to kill one of your slaves, let's say, towards the beginning of the shift. You want him to do a bit of work first. It makes sense that around 7 to 8 o'clock at night would have been the time that he was kicked down the stairs and unfortunately died. Now, along with this phantom crying that people have heard, the elevator, the old elevator that still runs part of the original building, is very, very horrible if anyone's been in there. It's the old type with a shutter on the front and a shutter up and down. It goes off on its own. It locks on its own. It goes up and down with people in it without pressing a single button. And I used to think, okay, when I got told this ghost story a long time ago, probably about 5 to 6 years ago, I thought, yeah, okay, whatever. And I'll go and have a quick look at the building myself, have a wander around when it was still a museum. I was in there with a couple of friends, a couple of family members. I was stood in the lift towards the top. Before we even closed the doors, it started to go down of its own accord. No one had pushed a button. And since the day, I've actually had a phobia of lifts because of this building, unfortunately. I used to think it was just a one-off, just a random occurrence, until I've heard this has happened on numerous times. Different people, different times of day, normally the same thing, a lift from the top going down on its own accord without anyone pressing a button or without any of the safety measures engaged. Now, it's also gone off when people aren't in the lift and staff have been there on their own and they've just watched the lift come down from floor to floor to floor to open on the ground floor and have no one inside. That is definitely a reason to be afraid of lifts. It's right there. So, as it is a building we can't get into, hopefully over the next coming months, coming years, it will be somewhere that on a tour we might be able to tour and go inside. However, if you do get to go inside there over the next few months when it's occasionally open to the public, don't go in the lift. That's all I'm going to say. Use the stairs. Now, we've got a few more stories left before we finish today's tour. We're going to get on to possibly one of my favourite stories now. However, to get there, it is not a very pleasant walk, so I do apologise. The path is very, very thin as we go through, and it's actually down there. It is shaded, however, which is very nice, especially for me. So if you want to follow me this way. So now everyone's finally caught up. You can't say I don't take you to some of the most different places of Derby city centre. We're now joined outside St Mary's Gate Bridge Chapel, not to be confused with St Mary's Gate Bridge Church. The chapel has been on this ground for many hundreds of years. I'm not going to bore you about the history about the chapel, because there's no ghost story associated with it. The story I want to tell you about relates to the bridge. The bridge just directly behind everyone, and the bridge we've all walked beneath today. Now, throughout today's tour you may have seen me occasionally looking at this little book I've got in my back pocket. That's because this little book has got the occasional name and the occasional date just to refresh my memory for these stories. However, for this one, it contains several quotes, as the story relates to quite a famous instance in Derby history. But not just Derby history, English history and world history. So, without further ado, does anybody watch BBC Two? Anyone at all? Does anyone remember, towards the end of last year, there was a TV show called Gunpowder that starred Kit Harington of Game of Thrones fame, enrolled in the plot to blow up Westminster. Everyone roughly remember a little bit about it? Well, it was all roughly to do with the Protestants, the Catholics, the Church of England and the Church of Catholic, the Pope. Throughout English history there have been many times of religious persecution, but in the middle of the 1500s it was really at its height. If you're a Catholic priest and you didn't go to a Church of England proceeding, didn't follow the Church of England's rules, guess what happened to you? Dead. You were instantly hung, you were beheaded, tortured, you name it, it happened to you, just because you practiced a slightly different faith to someone else. Now this story relates to three priests. First is Robert Ludlam, and the most famous of these priests. The 12th of July 1588, he was at the house of another priest when soldiers raided the house. They took Ludlam and the other priest and took them away to their respective councils, their respective parishes, the areas they were in. Ludlam, along with one of the priests, ended up in Derby jail. He ended up at the one just near the lockup yard, the Corn Market Exchange jail. And he was locked away for a few days with another Catholic priest. So, as the joke always goes, there's three Catholic priests in a jail cell. Does sound like a brilliant joke. The three Catholic priests were locked up in a jail cell together and became quite friendly in the short days that they had together. It wasn't until July 23rd of the same year, 1588, that these three Catholic priests were taken from the jail to the Magistrates' Court, where the Magistrate Court stands today, the Derby Assizes Court as it was back in the day. And they were trialled for their crimes being that they practiced a slightly different faith. That's essentially how it went. They were found guilty, of course, guilty of high treason. Now, if you were convicted of a rape, a murder, horse stealing, something along those lines, a quite horrific crime that we would all consider a heinous crime that we'd expect people to be jailed for 20 to 30 years these days, chances are you'd be taken to the marketplace, you'd have a noose put around your neck, you'd drop through the gallows and you'd die. If you were to commit high treason, you'd have a few separate ways of how it would go. You'd either have a very simple beheading in front of a crowd, at which point they'd hold up your head and shout, "Behold, a traitor," or "a treasoner," as happened to the Pentrich martyrs in Derby. Or you'd get the more gruesome, the more grisly, the more gory, hanging, drawing and quartering. Now at this point I need one gentleman in particular. Anyone want to volunteer? Just one gentleman? I'm not going to murder anyone, you've only got to stand still. Come on. It's not going to go too badly for you, I can assure you of that. So, if you are being hung, drawn and quartered, First off, you have to be hung. Sir, are you hung? Ask your wife. First off, what would happen is a bag would be placed over your head. It'd normally be a silk bag or a very fine cloth bag. Unfortunately, I don't have a cloth bag with me today. Luckily, I don't have a noose with me today as well, sir.
Thankfully.
Most people think of a hanging as you drop to the gallows, your neck breaks instantly, and it's over and done with. No, no. What would happen to you, sir? You'd have a cloth placed over your face, a noose placed around your neck, at which point you'd very slowly be hoisted into the air. Not 6, 7, 9, 10 feet in the air. No, just about a foot. Just enough that you can't touch the floor and you kick around in the breeze. During this time, you're going to strangle yourself, you're going to suffocate, you're going to slowly die. Throughout all this, the reason the bag is placed over your head isn't to protect your own anonymity, no, it's to protect the crowd around us. Your eyes would burst out of your head, blood would pour out of your ears, the muscles in your neck, mouth, jaw, tongue would all contract and expand rapidly as you panic, twitch, jump around on the rope, panic, twitch, and so on as you're currently gasping for air. If you were lucky, you'd only bite through your lips. If you're unlucky, you'd bite through your lips, your tongue, and also shatter your own teeth with the pressure as you're biting down too much. All this going along while you're still twitching along, gagging for air. So, this would last 5 to 10 minutes. For these high treasoners, these Catholic priests, it lasted for 30 minutes. At which point, they were still alive. 30 minutes, they were all cut down. The bags were removed from their head. Unfortunately, they didn't have too much of a gruesome experience. The odd blood trickling out the nose, trickling out the eyes, and trickling out the ears. One of them did bite into their tongue and cut the very tip of it off, but nothing too gory, fortunately. Following on from there, the priests were cut down, released of all their shackles, and the next step isn't drawing. Before they are drawn, they are emasculated. Now, so you may know what emasculation is. If you don't, someone gets a very, very sharp knife, heats it up over a very, very hot fire until it's glowing, and then cuts off this bit here. Now, if you're a woman and you commit high treason, you are hung, drawn and quartered, you got off lightly. They don't cut anything off in this emasculation process. Instead, they just hang you very briefly, then burn you at the stake. So you did get off quite lightly. So far you've been hung, you've been emasculated. The next step is the drawing. Drawing is a nice term for disemboweling. You take a large knife, cut straight across the stomach, in between the nipples, right down to where they've just emasculated. At which point, the executioner would take his hand, he'd reach into the stomach and rip out the organs, one at a time. If it was a good executioner, you'd still be alive at this point. On the day, they had the best executioner. He was the tip top at the drawing part. He managed to draw out the organs of these priests while they were still slightly alive. All three of them died during the drawing process, as their intestines, their lungs, and even their heart were pulled out of the cavity in their body. Very gruesome. Following on from that, the final stage is that you'd be beheaded. At this point, you'd have to kneel down on a block if you were still alive, or be placed on a large block, and the executioner would take a very large axe, take a swing at the back of your neck, and hopefully it'd be one swing and the head would be clean off. Hopefully. Unfortunately, this executioner, he was very good at the sharp, cutty, finey parts of the tools, but not very good at the beheading part. He had a very dull axe. So as he swung 2 or 3 times into the back of the priest's head, he eventually had to take out one of his small knives and cut away at the last parts of sinew and tissue before holding the head up. These 3 heads were then placed on large metal spikes on the bridge just over the way. Quite nice, quite gruesome. The final part, the quartering. As it suggests, he'd be cut across the middle and across the middle. He'd be set into 4 separate quarters and normally scattered around the local parish, the local area, to warn off other treasoners and other wrongdoers. These quarters again were placed with the heads, ow, that fly hit me right in the eye, on the bridge just opposite us. So 3 priests cut into nice tiny little bits and put on display for all of the city to see. Now, unfortunately, you'll be dead. You can go sit back down.
Still alive.
It is not a very pleasant thing to happen. As I said, if you're a woman, you got off lightly. These 3 Catholic priests were very faithful. They loved their faith. They didn't want anything to deter their faith. And I have an exact quote I'm going to read out for you here. Out of the 3 priests that were hung, Nicholas Garlick hung first, Richard Simpson hung second, and Robert Ludlam hung third. Robert Ludlam, upon watching Nicholas Garlick, Richard Simpson, he hung, drawn and quartered, so he would have seen his 2 other friends, his 2 other priests, that he had known one of them for most of his life. He hung, drawn, disemboweled, emasculated and quartered. He stood on the makeshift gallows that they were going to slowly hoist him up onto, smiling, with a large smile on his face. When he asked if he had any last words, he said, "Venite benedicti die." As he was a Catholic priest, he spoke in Latin. The translation for this is, "Come ye blessed of God." At which point he was brought up onto the noose and then began his drawing, quartering execution. Not a very pleasant way to go. But he went out believing in the faith that he believed. Now, the story that goes with this part of the tour is that if you were to come back on the anniversary of these 3 priests' grisly demise and stand on the bridge, or the green that we are on right here, on July the 24th, you are apparently supposed to be able to hear the screams of the priests from 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 24th of July. You could hear their screams on this bridge. Now, I've never come down here on the 24th of July at 3 o'clock to hear the screams of these priests, and I don't think I ever will. Again, I've said this before on this tour, I'll say it again, I am petrified of all this kind of stuff. I love doing the history side, I love doing the haunting side of these tours. However, if anyone here is feeling brave, unfortunately we have missed it this year, but you've got plenty of time to prepare for next year. Bring out your cameras, your EVP devices, set yourself up on the bridge, bring a nice little picnic, sit out on the lawn in the lovely sunshine we get. And if you hear the screams, then you'll know the story. And if you do hear the screams, please tell me, but don't tell me to come out here and listen to them for myself. Now, this is the last story before the pub. Woohoo! Pub! We're going to be finishing at the Dolphin. We're going to wander down the pathway to the right hand side, finish just outside in the courtyard. And after we finish, I'll tell you a couple of the brief stories about that. I'll be sticking around and then we can have a few more questions about it there. So if you want to follow me on to the Dolphin. So, we're joined at the final location of this short tour we have today. We are now at the old Dolphin Inn. Has anyone been to the old Dolphin Inn before?
Yes.
Many a time. It's possibly one of my favourite pubs within Derby. There's only a couple that I prefer to do on these tours. This is definitely one of them. For a number of reasons. There are a plethora of stories associated with this building. They claim to have up to 13 different spectres, spirits, ghosts, ghouls, poltergeists, phantasms, you name it, they claim to have it inside. However, there are 3 or 4 that are more popular than the rest. I'm only going to feature one of these stories on today's tour, as I normally feature the rest on my other tours throughout Derby. The story that I'm going to tell you is about a doctor. In the mid-1800s, doctors, tradesmen, lawyers, tanners, you name it, If you had some sort of trade, chances are you either practiced it in your own home or you rented a room in one of many Derby's inns or taverns, Tivens or Tans. It'd either be the Silk Mill opposite, the Old Bell, the Dolphin, the Djrs, the Djrs. You'd rent out a room. You'd either stay in the room as your own private abode, or you'd just rent it out to practice your trade, be it a doctor or a lawyer. There's instances of doctors being present in most of the inns in Derby. Now, the doctor in question stayed in one of the upstairs rooms in the old Dolphin Inn. And he was staying here in the golden age of medicine. Now, by the golden age of medicine, I mean they could pretty much do whatever they want and call it medicine. If you've got a headache, drill straight to the brain. That'll cure your headache. Are you feeling a bit under the weather? Have you tried putting a leech on your body? This is the extent of medicine they practiced. What we almost consider being a witch doctor these days. Now, this doctor was very, very well renowned. He was one of the best in Derby at the time. And the only way you got to be the best is practice, as doctors do today. They practice, they get better at their trade. The best way for a doctor to practice wasn't to go away to a university and study for 10, 15, 25 years, however long they wanted to. The best way was hands-on experience. And the best way to get hands-on experience was to go and talk to the local executioner in Derby. And that's exactly what the doctor did. He went to the executioner on the marketplace, and every time a body was hung, possibly drawn and quartered, or every time a criminal was executed in any way, he'd pay a small amount to the executioner, and then the executioner would bring the body to the doctor's place of work, where the doctor could then cut them apart in the night. What they tend to do is cut open the leg and go, that's what a shin bone looks like. I remember that for next time when I've got to patch someone up, or that's what a man's heart looks like. I remember that. Quite a hack job, really. However, when it got very, very quiet and there weren't many executions taking place, the doctor had to source bodies from other places. Cue the Burke and Hare story. Burke and Hare, two of the most famous body snatchers. Now, doctors weren't legally allowed to go and steal a body from a grave. However, one of the ways around it is they paid strangers to deliver a fresh body, a fresh cadaver to them. Be this an executioner or someone that has a relative suddenly die. They just bring the body to them, the doctor would cut them up, and then someone would collect the body for burial. One night, the doctor paid a new gentleman, a stranger, someone he'd never met before, to deliver a body to him. It was the body of a young 20-year-old girl. She'd apparently died from a blow to the head. The doctor looked over the body, checked for a pulse, definitely to make sure she was dead, and confirmed that she was in fact dead. So, he paid the gentleman, took her into the basement of the old Dolphin. In the courtyard there is a small hatch which leads directly into the basement, and in the basement there is a very large stone table about 4 foot off the ground, the perfect height if you wanted to conduct some sort of learning experiment, let's say. And he placed the girl on the stone. He then retired up to his room, had a drink, had a meal, and prepared his tools for the night's surgery, for the night's practice. Does sound quite gruesome, but that's essentially how he liked to enjoy his evenings. I personally enjoy Netflix. So, he gathered his tools and he went down to the basement. And he started. He stripped her off, cleaned her, and took out one of his largest knives, sharper than a scalpel. He was planning to take out her lungs, her heart, her rib cage, and go through her entire body and go through her organs and catalogue them. See if there was anything out of the ordinary, see what to expect in the next person, what a young, healthy person should look like on the inside. He took his knife, he plunged it straight into her chest, in between her ribs, and then dragged it down past her belly button towards the top of her abdomen. So far so good. Nice, clean, cut incision. Although he was alarmed that there was a little bit more blood than there ordinarily should be. However, he thought this body was incredibly fresh. The man did say it was his sister who had fallen down the stairs, took a blow to the head. So, an extremely fresh body. He was in luck. At which point, he got out his next tools and decided to spread the opening in this girl's body. He pulled them apart so he could see inside the organs. Again, he thought it was a little strange that there was a lot more blood than there should have been, but still plunged on in. Quite literally, he plunged on into this girl's stomach and began to pull out her large and small intestines. At which point, she screamed. She was still alive. The reason there was more blood is that she was only passed out. She was possibly in a coma. The shock of this doctor reaching in and pulling out of her organs brought her back round, and she woke up screaming. The doctor, recoiled in shock, also started to scream. At this point, the girl screaming, the doctor screaming, the girl screaming louder, and the doctor is screaming louder. All while the staff and the customers above are hearing this screaming, the commotion from below. The owner of the building ran down to the basement to see what had happened. He found the girl screaming on the floor, trying to push her organs back into her body, gushing with blood at this point as her heart's racing and blood's pumping throughout her body. The doctor, still recoiled, white as a sheet, still screaming to himself. Unfortunately, the girl died. A very horrible, horrible death. Now, the story with this doctor becomes vague at this point. Some people believe that he went insane and lived out the rest of his days in an asylum just north of Belper. Others believe that he went insane and took his life within the basement. The only thing we do know for definite is that the girl definitely lost her life in a terrible, screaming, stark way. Doing a little bit of digging, a little bit of history for this, I did find out that a girl did in fact die in the basement. And a doctor did die of a heart attack on the same day. He died of what was called a rude awakening. Funnily enough, the same verdict as what happened to the girl. So, she died of a very, very rude awakening, and the doctor died of a rude awakening on the same day. So we conclude that he did die either in the cellar or in his room, suffering from shock or grief after if he decided to take his life. Not very pleasant, not at all, especially if you were the person being cut up on that table in the dark, cold, very grimy floor, let's say. And I said this is one of many, many ghost stories associated with the building. Her screams, cold air, footsteps, but as I said, mainly her screams, I still heard coming from the cellars. Staff in there don't like going down there on their own. There was a period of time, a few months back, where they were going down in twos into the cellars. They were that creeped out by going downstairs. These screams are heard throughout the night, throughout the morning. Some people have even reported hearing them in the middle of the day, when they've been outside, enjoying a meal, enjoying a drink. They've sat outside in the smoking area out here and thought they'd heard screaming, but very faint, as if it was coming from either inside or below them. Now, that does officially conclude all the ghost stories that I have for you today. So, I would also like to say thank you ever so much for all turning up today. I know it's a free tour, so a little bit of something for nothing for everyone on this fine summer's day. I hope everyone has enjoyed themselves and I've been very entertaining for you all, hopefully, yes. If you have enjoyed it, please, please, please give us a review on Facebook, TripAdvisor. A lot of you do know the Facebook page already, but it is Haunted History Tours Derby. We do ghost walks throughout Derby City Centre. We're also expanding into South Derbyshire, things like Belper, Matlock, that kind of area. If you did like today's tour, chances are you're going to absolutely love our city centre tour. If you're interested in that, we've got various different dates between now, Halloween and going up towards Christmas. We're also on Groupon, which, let's be honest, if you're going to get it on Groupon. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot easier for me because they sort it all out bank-wise for me as well, I'll be honest. If you did enjoy today, you will enjoy the evening. It's about the same as this, except it's 3 hours and you won't hear any of these stories that you've heard today on that tour. We start at a pub, go to a pub on the tour and end at a pub as well. So if you're only interested in having spirits of a different variety, there's definitely something for you. If you're interested in hauntings, it's for you. If you're interested in history, it's for you. We try and feature a little bit of everything to cater for everyone. We also do random events. We'll do paranormal evenings. We will do ghost tours for private companies. If you own a haunted building and you want a tour of that, we can arrange that as well. However, we do have a bit of a surprise in line for Halloween. If you did like today's tour and you are thinking of coming onto a tour, we are planning something for Halloween, which will be our ordinary city centre tour, followed with a couple of spooky stories, and hopefully, if a couple of the pubs will allow me to do it, we will also be conducting a Ouija board and talking board sessions at the end of the tour. Again, this is only based on if they will let me do it in some of these pubs. Some of them are very tetchy about it, as I'm sure you can imagine. Hopefully I will be able to announce that in the next couple of weeks on Facebook, so do stay tuned to that. And lastly, I'll just say again, thank you all for coming. Without you guys being here, it's just me talking to a camera for an hour and I look mental dressed like this. If you have enjoyed it, tell your friends, give us a review, tell everyone that you had a lovely time.